Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, and welcome to Oral and Interpersonal Communications. Um, my name is Beth Matson-Weil, Instructor Weil, if you're feeling formal or need to refer to me at WTC. Um, and this is the online version of Oral and Interpersonal Communications, which is going to be a little bit strange to have an interpersonal course online. But seeing as how in the modern world we're increasingly forced and encouraged to interact with our peers online anyhow, even at business and school, we'll maybe just work through this interesting challenge together, figure out how to interact online interpersonally. First of all, your syllabus in Blackboard is in both the course materials section and in the first week's folder as a PDF. But let's take a quick look at it. This class is going to be 15 weeks, and there's going to be a lot of text and writing. And even though we'll do plenty of videos together, you will definitely have to use lots of reading and writing and text. So if that is not a strong suit for you, you might want to think about taking this class in another format. I will make as many accommodations as I can and make everything as smooth and easy and simple as possible, but there's going to be text and reading and writing. And if that's not your strong suit, you might prefer to get this information from an in-classroom format. Every week in this class, we're going to do a few things. There will be a very easily recognizable pattern to our coursework. Every week, we are going to do a Learn Smart assignment. And Learn Smart is part of the McGraw-Hill Connect version of our textbook. The physical version of your textbook, as listed in your syllabus, looks like this. Communication Matters. And they have an online e-version, and Learn Smart connects with that, so that instead of giving a quiz or an exam to make sure that we all understand the information in the textbook, it combines asking you questions with your confidence level. And for any given question, you can click on a button within Learn Smart inside of Connect, inside of McGraw-Hill Online, that will take you to the paragraph in the book, to the section in the book that the question is referencing. So I prefer those to make sure that your mastery of text information is up to par. And after each Learn Smart section, which makes sure you understand the reading material in the book, then there will also be a mini lecture, a lot like this, where I give extra context and real-world connections to the information in the book. So the book will be the basic, and then I'll tack a little bit more on with a video lecture or links or images that relate to our real lives a little bit more, that elaborate on the text material. And then each of you and myself will go into the Blackboard discussion boards and we'll discuss the material. And then after discussing, there will, for each of you, be an individual journal entry for each week. So you can relate your personal information and we can make a more individual learning experience. So there's going to be book work, there's going to be extra context added, there's going to be a discussion board, and there's going to be a journal entry every week. As we go through the class later, there will also be a video presentation project so that we can incorporate the oral part of this communication interpersonally. But we'll talk much more about that later. Do not worry about it yet. We're still just in the basics. And because this is video, just like if I was in front of the real classroom, you'll see me looking down at my notes and clicking my pen. And we can talk about these fidgets and things and using them effectively when we get to your video presentations. In general, all of the assignments, including the discussion board and the Learn Smart sections of the book and the journal, will be assigned on Mondays and will be due the following Sunday. But don't wait until late in the week to do them, because if you have to read the text before listening to the video lecture, and then you also have to start a discussion before you can reply to other people's discussion posts, and then you also have to use all of that information to write your journal entry, if you start on Saturday, you're going to be out of time and not get the points. So make sure that very early in the week you are checking for everything that you need to have to do in order, and start it early. If by Tuesday you haven't done any work for this class, you should be a little bit nervous. You should be starting your work by Tuesday and getting on top of all of it so it doesn't get on top of you. If there is anything that comes up that doesn't make sense, just email me. It is super easy. I will check it every day. And if for some reason I am taking my preschooler to the dentist, it will probably only be a couple hours before I get back to that email. So it's the best way to reach me. Please feel free. When anything comes up, if something doesn't make sense, if there's a question, if there's a concern, anything, drop an email. If I happen to not see something, a question you asked on the discussion board, and you want to call my attention to it before I get there in the natural course of reading through everyone's posts, send me an email. Super available. So welcome. Let's jump in there. This is a communications class. So what we're going to cover first is what on earth this communication nonsense is, and why it's so important, and why do we need it. This is largely chapter 1. So if you want to pause here and go do the Learn Smart for chapter 1, that would be a brilliant plan, because most of the things that I talk about are from the chapter. Everything that I'm adding to will be much easier to understand if you've already seen it in the chapter. As the book says, there are multiple reasons for communicating. And this feels a little bit silly and a little bit cheesy, but as we go through, we're going to discover why. Why does anyone bother to study communication? Why does WTC want you to have communications, abilities for workplace, for school, for just being human? So we're going to start at the really corny basic level and continue to talk about why. Why do we need a communications class? So the book lists physical needs, social needs, identity and self-concept needs, spiritual, philosophical, and ethical needs, instrumental, goal-oriented needs, emotional needs, and formal needs. So that sounds like a long, broad, and simultaneously obvious list. Why do we need to know any of this? Of course, we use communication to address our physical needs, our identity needs, our emotional states. It can seem really bland and obvious. But something that happens is that before people studied communication, they had no model to describe what was going wrong when people didn't get communication, when communication went sideways, or when there was a communication disorder. And one of the first people who illustrated why that list of why we communicate is so important was named Harry Harlow. He was a psychologist and he worked primarily with monkeys. And he took some monkeys and he removed them from their mothers. So he took away all monkey communication and he left them only with inert objects. So in this same section of Blackboard, I have listed the links to the other videos that we're going to watch to supplement this. So I need you to pause this video, watch the Harry Harlow monkeys video, and then come back and we will move right on discussing that video. So maybe our protocol here will be to say, nope, really, I mean it, pause it here, go watch it, and then I'll count to 3 and move on with talking about the video because I've already seen it. 1, 2, 3. So, Harry Harlow's monkeys, removed from all communication except what? These very first things that the book lists. We need communication for physical needs, right? So all those baby monkeys in the cages with the terry cloth or the wire bottle mother, all the communication they were getting was physical needs. They had oxygen, they had a bottle, and they had to choose between which kind of communication do they want. Do they want the milk or do they want comfort, physical coziness? And as you saw, they often chose the coziness. They were so desperate to increase even the level of communication just from their basic survival needs. Great, I've got air. Great, I've got milk. The next thing they craved was still more physical a higher level of physical communication. And what was missing? Which kinds of communication did they not get, and what happened? Did you see what happened to those monkeys when they didn't get communication? Right? When they didn't get higher levels of communication, they didn't know how to do any of those other elements that communication is supposed to provide. They only checked off the first communication element on the list. They checked off physical needs. They did not check off social relationship communication needs, identity needs. They don't even know how to act like monkeys. Their ethics needs, when they were put into groups of monkeys, they didn't know how to interact. They didn't know, don't steal that toy, don't steal that banana from the other monkey, because they didn't get monkey communication about how to be a monkey with their identity or how to have the ethics of a monkey, that we don't just grab things. They didn't have any goal-oriented needs. What do monkeys do? Is my goal today to go build a nest? They don't know. They weren't communicated to. They didn't know how to interpret their own emotional states. You can watch them rocking and sucking on their own thumbs and toes because they honestly had never been communicated anything about what emotions a monkey can express. And they also had no formal communication, which means that they didn't know how to do the postures. That not only did they not know how to build a nest, but they didn't know how to strike a posture of apology with another monkey. So it led to lots of aggression because they basically just didn't know how to be monkeys. And Harlow talked about it in terms of love and maternity. But if every time they refer to the phrase, our earliest social environment or love, you exchange the word communication, it's those exact levels of communications they took out. And as it turns out, love is just one of those kinds of communication that teaches any given creature how to be what that creature is expected to be. So, just to comfort you a little teeny tiny bit, those monkeys, Harlow also studied recovery. And it was equally tragic and horrifying, but he did study recovery. And the recovery that he studied, I gave you a link to the documentation, so there's not a cute video for it. He studied recovery with their non-isolated peers. So he would take a monkey that he had isolated and not given any communication to, and he would put it with monkeys who had received appropriate monkey communication all their lives. And those monkeys could start teaching the communication to the isolated monkeys, and within a couple generations, their line would have recovered. The isolated monkeys, never perfect monkeys. They could never master what hadn't been communicated initially. But they started to gather some of those higher levels, and then their offspring tended to gather all of the levels of communication. So that's what happens with monkeys, but what happens with humans who don't receive the right kind of communication? There are lots of really tragic, horrifying, heart-wrenching stories of humans who do not get the right kinds of communication in the first place. If humans do not get higher levels of communication, they only get that physical level, and they never move up into the social relationships and identity and all those higher levels, they tend to not thrive. You may have seen videos of orphans who were left in cribs and they were given bottles, but the orphanage staff didn't have time to hold and talk to each baby sweetly. They tend to actually literally just rock in the corner, which is super heart-wrenching and hard to handle. But it's again another illustration of how important all these different levels of communication are and why people bother to study it. There is one little girl in particular. Her name is Oksana Malaya, and she's from Russia. And she was horribly, horribly neglected. Her family let her out in the courtyard, a penned-in courtyard with the family's dogs. And the dogs took her in and raised her and kept her alive for many years until her abuse was discovered and she was rescued. So this is another point at which I want you to pause and go watch the video while I count to 3, and then we're going to talk about Oksana and how her levels of communication have been affected. 1, 2, 3. So who was it in the beginning of her life that was primarily communicating with Oksana, right? It's not that she wasn't communicating at all. she has some really, really specific communication. Her primary communicators were dogs. So she learned canine communication. It's not that there was no communication, it just wasn't human communication. She learned to function with the levels of physical needs of dogs. She knows how to turn on a water spout with her mouth, which I definitely don't think I could do on the first try. She learned from communication how to meet her physical needs. Her social relationships, all of those postures she was doing, that's not just a human being crawling. Those postures, the angle of her back and her hips and her legs and the tilt of her head, those were extremely, extremely specific social cues and identity cues, and ethics. She knew that when she left the water and her front paws were wet, that she had to shake the water off before she went into the cozier area. Did you see her do that in the video? She's following dog ethics. She knew the postures to communicate what her emotional states were. She knew how to bark. She knew how to look friendly. They were extremely, extremely detailed communications. They just happened not to be human. So if there's no human style communication, she just became less human until she was rescued. Thank goodness. Which brings up an interesting point, which is which of these levels of human communication do we need to be human? You know, like how much of this list, what percentage of this list can we miss out on before we're left somewhat isolated because we're not on the same page as everyone else? There is another video that you may pause and watch that I think is super helpful to talk about human development relative to communication. It will again talk about Harry Harlow and some other stages of human development like attachment. But every time they're talking about love or attachment, if you, in your mind, put in the word communication, what we will really easily find is that all of those levels of human development also mimic the exact levels of communication that humans need to function. So pause here if you'd like to go watch that. I'll count to 3 and then move on. 1, 2, 3. So really for all creatures, the development of the creature really mimics the levels of communication that it's receiving. You know, we can't just have the physical needs. We have to start moving up the ladder if we're going to have a fully functional member of any creature's society, especially humans. And something that illustrates this really nicely, rather than just a bland list from the book about why we have communication, is Maslow. Maslow was another psychologist, and he came up with a hierarchy of needs. That is a pyramid. The most basic thing on the bottom of the pyramid that we all need, all living creatures, are physiological. It's the same as those monkeys. Yeah, they needed the bottle and the wire mother, and they needed the oxygen, and they needed the water, you know, like basic physiological things. And then you can start moving up to the higher levels, or moving down that list of reasons that we communicate in the book, to such things as safety. Not only do I have air and water and food, but I'm not worried that anybody's going to take them away. I feel relatively secure. No one's coming after my basic needs. I have the basic needs and nobody's coming after them. And then on top of that, you can add love, which is basically just connection. Somebody else with whom to communicate, that you're not in a vacuum. You don't just have food and water. It's not just being left for you without being taken away, but there's someone else in your environment. There's someone with whom to communicate, which Maslow described as love. And then esteem means that that person who's there to connect with is giving you positive regard, that the other creature in your situation is not giving you negative feedback. It's not just that you have an interaction, it's that you have a positive interaction. And then after the majority of your needs have been met, you have food and water, you're feeling safe, there is a connection, that connection is positive, then the very top of the pyramid comes the self-actualization. And that becomes the communication that we are searching after. We want the communication that is at the top of the pyramid. We need all the kinds of communication, but what we're really going for to be amazing students and amazing coworkers and citizens is to be able to use all the levels of communication, not just a couple. And so that's a lot of what this class is going to focus on, is how to take us from this base animal instinct and safety all the way up to how do we become a good coworker and neighbor and student via accessing all of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is also a hierarchy of communication. And we know that this is going to play out really easily in the workplace. In your book, Table 1.2 lists personal qualities most sought after by employers. Ability to work in a team structure, communication, ability to communicate verbally. We're going to do a little bit less of that because we're online, but we're still going to get plenty of verbal time. Ability to make decisions and solve problems. Ability to obtain and process information. Ability to plan, organize, and prioritize work. And all of this comes from communication, because if we can't listen and we can't communicate clearly with others, we're going to be the monkeys who don't know how to do the right postures, who don't know to do anything but snuggle a little washcloth. So we're going to practice fleshing out all of these different hierarchy of communication needs to be fully functional monkeys. There are several models of communication. The most basic implies communication as an action, just one action. The action of a person speaking is communication. The action of a speaker providing you with audio is an action-oriented model of communication. It didn't take very long for a linguist who likes to study communication to add to that and make communication an interaction. Not only is the broadcast important, but the reception, that there has to actually be a listener, that it's not communication if there's no listener, that it really is then just a broadcast if no one's listening. If there's no receiver and there's only a speaker, it's not really communication. It has to be an interaction. And then that actually theory didn't last very long either. Along came communication as a transaction, implying that the listener can't just be an inert object. The listener is providing almost half of that conversation. The real communication, whether it be eye contact or a high five or a verbal conversation, unless there is a transaction where both parties are contributing, either via broadcast or listening, and going back and forth in those roles, that it's not really solid communication. And of course, this gets even more complex because there are different styles of communication. That it can be intrapersonal when you're talking to yourself, maybe just inside your head, or maybe listing things to yourself in the grocery. You're talking to yourself, it's intrapersonal. Interpersonal means there are at least two people, and the communication is between at least the two of them. There's small group communication, which we'll spend quite a bit of time studying. There is public communication, and there is mass communication. So if you take all these different styles of communication and you add in all the different things that can go wrong, we end up with a very complex system, which is why there's a whole textbook about communications. And then some other things to know about communication in just the most basic sense is that it's never simple. It is so rarely simple, right? You think about even an infant snuggling with a parent, and it doesn't stay simple for very long. There is perhaps a very animal immediacy to the basic level of air, food, water, and snuggles, but it doesn't last. It almost immediately involves verbal or signing or some other kind of language. And all of these factors are implicated in all the different styles of communication. So you can have intrapersonal communication where you're literally talking to yourself. You can have mass communication that is a stadium of people. They're not having a conversation verbally, but using their cheers and their tone of cheering and their style of cheering, they're still having a giant group conversation. It's almost always multi-channel, which means that it doesn't just involve eyes or ears or your nose. It usually involves all of your senses. That we all have perceptual filters, that we have a viewpoint through which we are looking, and it automatically affects the message. That not just our personal connection to the material, but our cultural, societal connection to the material makes a huge difference. we will spend an entire next week discussing culture and how it affects communication. Um, Communication can be literal or figurative. It can be factual or emotional. You could be listening for facts and details, like in a math class, or you could be listening for the emotions and empathy, like you are with your best friend. It can be subjective or objective. It can be something completely objective on the text in the page, which I argue wouldn't be true. Your font and spacing and tone of writing would still affect it, but at least the information would be present on the page. Or it could be someone playing charades with you, which is completely subjective, where you're being encouraged to interpret it however you personally can. It can be formal or informal. You could have a boss that you like to give high fives to, or you could have a boss who wants everything in triplicate on paper or faxed or on a certain cover sheet. So all of these things will come into play. But basically what you need to know so far is that communication is so important because it shapes identity and social skills and spiritual and ethics and instrumental goal-oriented needs and emotional states and formal communication. We couldn't exist without any communication. It is completely essential to who we are as creatures that we have all of this information. So go take a look at Maslow's pyramid. It can help you conceptualize why we need all the different levels of communication. Think about Oksana and think about Harlow and why it is that we have to study communication and take a communications class, and why we have to address basic human, simple concepts and needs before we can talk about how to write the world's best cover letter. Okay, so you made it through the first video. I'm going to stop this one here and move on to listening, which we also need to cover this week. It's a lot to cram into 1 week, but they're both things that we have to have up front to successfully complete this class. So welcome. Sorry to front load so much information, and talk to you more soon. Email me if you have any questions or concerns.